It's my grandchildren's children, I think we have to be getting ready for.
Right.
So it's going to be a long lot to bring back the whole thing into balance.
Well, it is. I mean, you're right. There's an inherent contradiction I see is going on. One of them is, I mean, mostly in most stable societies, there's a certain deference paid to older people to be the natural rulers. I mean, the men in this room are the natural rulers, of a society, and women too. The older people should be the ones that make the rules and enforce them. In our society, we've got more and more young people are more and more catered to, more and more ruling the world and marginalizing the old. So what's the solution? Can we look to the next generation of young people? When the problem in some senses, in some ways, it's a youth culture that is out of control. I think so. I mean, I think we're in the middle of it. I mean, in many ways, this is a kind of a witch hunt that we're seeing. Most witch hunts are bubbles. They eventually burst. They can ruin a lot of lives and do a lot of damage before they do burst. But eventually they do. I think in some ways it is a bubble that's going to burst eventually. I think young people, young men especially, need to be bold, as young men used to be encouraged to do, but are not anymore, and exercise the leadership, because they're the ones that have the most to lose, and they're the ones who are the natural leaders of the next generation. So I think I do see that there's a possibility. I mean, I see a lot of youth culture today that's very unhealthy, very decadent, very depraved in many ways. But I also see the possibility, every generation rebels against the previous one. And maybe in this case, the rebellion will be more constructive than it was in the case of my generation. Those of us who grew up in the 60s, as you know, I mean, we're kind of in some ways, we kind of did it to ourselves in some ways. In our youth, we kind of did it to ourselves 30, 40 years later. Hopefully the next generation will be more constructive. We see this to some extent in the post-communist.
But Peter, or Stephen, isn't there a problem there in that the very nature of the syndrome of constructed fatherlessness, it locks us into the problem?
Yes, it does. You're right. The fatherlessness passes down the problem from one generation to the next, doesn't it? It breaks that possibility of teaching from one generation to the next, and it passes pathologies down. I mean, there's one line of argument among some psychologists that one of the causes of homosexuality, for example, is a ruptured or impaired relationship with the father. Well, that's precisely the kind of domestic configuration that we've institutionalized in the welfare state and the divorce machinery, right? Institutional families where the father is marginal or removed. It's like we use public policy to create environments where there's as much homosexuality as well as gang warfare and other forms of twisted masculinity as possible. So how do you do that? How do you rebuild something that has to pass down from one generation to the next? One solution is a religious revival. This is one way it's happened in the past. Is religious revivals tend to rejuvenate the family and parental authority in times of chaos. That's one possible solution. They're not always pretty. They sometimes result in violence and disruption of their own. Sometimes political, revivals, if you like, quasi-religious political revivals. So that's one possibility, is some kind of religious revival. When I see the religious revivalism going on among certain Christians today, I think I'm not encouraged. So many Christian groups don't seem to want to take on the family head on in a realistic way. So that's one option that history has given us. Again, it's not one that I'm sure is the solution this time.
Yeah, because one of the things we saw in the recent referendum was that far from representing themselves, still farther from representing their role as father, to speak for the putative next generation, they actually fell behind women.
Well, I see your point. Yes, I see this among even fathers groups, even fathers' rights groups, oftentimes subscribe to these kind of philosophies. There's this movement of MGTOW, which I realize is not a unified movement. Some of the people in it are very good. Some of the views they espouse I disagree with. I don't think the solution is for men to separate from women, to have their own institutions. I think the solution is for men to take their natural role in society again, as part of the society and part of the family, not to separate from the family and live hedonistic lifestyles. You know, again, I think that's a serious mistake.
Any last couple of questions, Roger?
Yeah, I think we all of us owe a debt of gratitude to Stephen for what he's done in his book, bringing together the scope of the problem. I would like, perhaps you might consider doing that in your future book, Stephen, if you consider the economic and the legal aspects of all of this. Because I don't think we can escape the fact that we live now in a society where God is not, the deity, it's consumerism. And in a society where consumerism is God, women will always be the preferred sex. I mean, the word husband is actually a verb. It means to protect and to manage with frugality and prudence, and that's what husbands always did, and that's why they had to be got rid of, because they were not good for a consumer society. And you can see that in so many aspects of, you talk about the welfare state, and this is all about the government empowering itself. Since Ireland and most Western societies brought in the idea of VAT, that means that the government makes money every time something is bought or sold. So, it used to be income tax was their only revenue. And if they raised income tax too much, people worked less. So there was always a finite amount of income. With VAT, as long as they can keep pumping consumerism and do that by promoting women, because they make their decisions. They say 90% of the time, I think maybe 99% of the time. So, everything is geared towards making sure that women are in control of the money so they can spend it. The other aspect then is that you say you don't cover, because your book is mostly politics, and it's true, is the actual legal analysis of what's going on. I mean, not just in family law, but in law generally. Is this move away from rights, which is what law is, into what's happening now, and that's equity, where like the applicant in all family law is actually somebody who doesn't have any rights to ask for what they're asking for, but they're going there to get justice, because that's the idea of equity.
Relief.
Is that it gives you relief where the law is inappropriate and won't give you what's needed. But the essence of equity is not being carried through, and that is the applicant must always have clean hands, i.e. the applicant in every family law application must be the deserted spouse. And it never is.
It's the opposite.
And they've made sure that those rules and that evidence that's required to do that is not required for them to do that.
Right.
So if your next book introduces that would give us a really good way to analyse it and come up with a solution.
Right. Well, I do deal with those legal aspects to some extent in both books. The idea that how innovative all these things are in the law, and you're a little bit on this concept of law versus equity and so forth. Because you're right. I mean, at least since the 17th century, I know of, equity has been an excuse to deviate from the law and to dispense injustice in many ways. So there have been a long line of complaints from various reformers about equity. You're right. But yes, it could be more, and certainly the economic aspects I only go into just a little bit and then very speculatively. So yes, I mean the book in many ways, both books, especially the second one, is really an amalgam of what scholarship exists on these various topics already, with some tying it all together and then trying some speculation on things that other people could do. So it's really an invitation for other scholars to come along, and I mean every chapter in this book could be a whole book in its own right. Some of them are already, but some of them are not. So I hope that other scholars, legal scholars, economists, sociologists, whatever, will come along and take aspects of this and write whole books about it. I mean, that would be very useful for all of us. And it'll become the same kind of publishing industry that the, feminism and queer studies are now. But so there's plenty to feed on if academics want to write about it. I think there's a Pulitzer Prize in this for journalists who bite the bullet and deal with some of these issues. But trying to convince journalists of that is another matter.
Just to finish, I mean, I think this has been a wonderful evening. We've heard many fascinating aspects of this, and again, our numbers are small. We haven't a hope of filling the yard of Dublin Castle anytime soon. But I think, what Benedict said, the truth always has a future, and this is the truth, and therefore, there will come a time when our descendants will look back on these days and recognize that, as in the past in relation to many other questions, a terrible injustice was allowed to ferment under the surface and ignored and overlooked and buried and repudiated by the elites of the time. I think when that day comes, somebody will remember the night that Stephen Baskerville came to Dublin and was here in a small group in Hume Street. And that's the way history tends to work. And I think it's very important that we hold to those ideas and cling to that kind of concept, because the only fear I have about this, because sometimes it's very easy to be persuaded to give up, and sometimes I have given up, and I think in some ways the only way you can continue is give yourself the right and the freedom to give up, because then you go on freely. But the only fear I really have is that I will give up the day before the revolution. That would be a terrible tragedy. So I want to really thank Stephen for coming to Dublin and giving us his time, and we hope we will see him again, and the numbers will grow each time. And thank you all for coming and making this, I think, a hugely successful night. And just to say again, Peter, Stephen's book is here. It's €15. I think it's really an amazing insight into the nature of not just the present but the future. I mean, it is a sketch of the future that has been laid out for us, unless we start to do something pretty quickly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.